We now bring to you a panel discussion on future of livelihoods in sport, safety, and worker security. In light of the lockdown restrictions as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic, the panel will discuss the future of livelihoods of athletes and that of support staff in sport. They will discuss athlete health and safety concerns upon a post-COVID return and the importance of player unions and social security after retirement. The panel will also look at the conditions of the often forgotten stakeholders of the sports ecosystem, such as ground staff, security, and housekeeping staff, comprising mainly informal workers and the key issues they face. Our panelists are Ms. Nisha Millet, Olympian and Arjuna Award winner. She won more than 600 gold medals in her swimming career, and she represented India at the 2000 Sydney Olympics. She is currently the director of the Nisha Millet Swimming Academy. Mr. Brendan Schwab, Executive Director, World Players Association. Mr. Saurabh Bhattacharjee, Assistant Professor, the West Bengal National University of Juridical Sciences, where he teaches courses on labor law and law and impoverishment. Mr. Somdev Devvarman, former tennis player, Padma, Shri, and Arjuna Award winner, Commonwealth Games and Asian Games gold medalist. And the moderator of the session, Kritika NS, researcher at the Sports Law and Policy Center. She has written articles for leading publications such as The Hindu and The Wire. Due to unforeseen circumstances, Mr. Harsh Mandar, who was originally slated to be part of the panel, won't be part of the panel today. And if you do have any questions during this panel, do type them into the Q&A box below, and our panelists will try to answer some of them. Over to Kritika and the panel.
Thank you all for joining us today, and thank you to all our viewers, especially for tuning in during such trying times. So diving straight to the panel, I'd like to begin with a short introduction. Back in 1898, Leo Tolstoy, in his famous essay, questioned, that the essay was called What is Art? And I'll dive straight into why it's relevant to us. So he questioned why art is so important that hundreds and thousands of people spend their entire lives, sometimes even starting from childhood, completely dedicating their entire lives and bodies to the world of art itself. He went on to specify that jewelers and sculptors and artists and carpenters just waste away their entire lives to a structure they're never going to be recognized for. Now, perhaps in the year 2020, we can pose the same question to the world of sport. Why do so many people, caddies, ball boys, ball girls, even athletes, spend their entire lives and dedicate it to a structure where they may or may not be recognized and may not even be adequately compensated for? Now, when Tolstoy questioned this, his larger question was to go into the essence of art itself. What is good art? But in today's discussion, we're not going to question whether sport is important. The fact that all of us have congregated here today in the middle of a global pandemic just shows us that sport in itself is relevant and important. But what we must question is whether sport and the sporting structures of today adequately compensate for the lives that are dedicated to it. And I'll be dividing the discussion today into two primary parts. We understand that athletes and coaches are laborers in themselves and they do perform work. And we do need to address that in light of the changing circumstances during the pandemic and after. But what we also need to look into are the lives of the much more invisibilized people in the sporting structures. These can be people like our caddies and our ball boys and ball girls. So how does sport compensate for these lives? So to start off, I'd like to ask Brendan to just kickstart the discussion and just let us know what's the current state of play right now? How are athletes dealing with the crisis? How are coaches going to be compensated? And how are the other workers, often ignored, going to sort of deal with this crisis and the many months and probably years after?
Well, the World Players Association represents some 85,000 athletes through about 120 player associations in over 60 countries. Some of those are global unions like the Federation of International Cricketers Association. I know India is a big cricket country, and also FIFPro, which represents soccer players. But we're also part of Uni Global Union, which is the global union federation for the services sector. And so therefore, we are part of the broader labour movement. And what I would say is one of the great learnings of the COVID-19 pandemic is the development of this notion of the essential worker, that before the crisis hit, a lot of the work that was precarious and undervalued, be it work in care, be it in grocery stores, be it post and delivery, a whole lot of the work that was becoming more, cleaning, for example, was becoming more and more precarious, more and more lowly paid, more and more difficult for people to be able to undertake in a way where they could have what we call decent work so that they could provide for a good life and a sustainable life for themselves and their family. Hopefully the impact of the pandemic has taught the population at large to respect this work, and not just for the period of the pandemic, but on an ongoing basis. If there is to be a profoundly positive legacy from COVID-19, is that everyone values the work that everyone does, that every person is entitled to dignity and respect. In relation to the athletes themselves and sport, and this is also an issue which is true of the broader society, what the pandemic highlighted immediately was the lack of liquidity in the economy and in the sports system. And so athletes had to very quickly try and come to terms with two very powerful forces. One was a public health crisis, which we knew very little about, and the other was the devastating economic impact of the shutdown. Now, in order to deal with those things, it's clear that the player associations, which were the strongest, the player associations which had the more power, were the ones which were in a stronger position to negotiate a reasonable economic adjustment for the terms of the pandemic, and also make sure that the health-based information was accurate. What we did as a World Players Association in response to the pandemic was to convene all of our unions and develop what we called a set of guiding principles so that we could start to negotiate our way through the pandemic. And one of those critical guiding principles was that public health comes first. Now that might sound self-evident, but you may remember that in the early part of the pandemic, the International Olympic Committee, for example, was insistent that the Games would go ahead in Tokyo. And the athletes made it very clear to us that it is wrong for sport to exacerbate the pandemic, that sport has a social role to play in setting a standard of how industry and society should respond to this unprecedented crisis. Another very important part of those guiding principles was access to the best public information. And so there needs to be an underpinning respect for human rights. We saw the incredible courage of the doctors who became whistleblowers in China, some of whom actually lost their lives because of the pandemic. And we were told as athletes that, including from the International Olympic Committee, that this is a virus which only affects old people, that young people will suffer nothing more than flu-like symptoms. And this was in the very early stages. The knowledge of the pandemic, or the disease, we should say, COVID-19, was very limited. We're talking in March. The disease was unearthed in November, so it's only 5 months later. So we had to get access to our own doctors, our own medical people, who could then enable us to negotiate from a position of strength in order to protect the health of the players. So what that means is that those workers and those other people who can't access such top quality information, they were in a very vulnerable position. And so while some of the athletes in the strongest unions are bringing in world-class medical advice, world-class epidemiologists to negotiate these issues, some of the precarious workers are trying to negotiate access to the PEPs. They couldn't even get masks. They couldn't even have places to clean their hands. Some workers weren't entitled to sick leave. And so the impact was devastatingly different. And that's why we see, for example, such shocking death rates in, for example, care facilities, where people were not protected, people were not represented well in comparison with the athletic population, where some have been able to be represented at a world-class level. But even, of course, I must say that the experiences for the athletes are very different indeed. Where are we now? Of course, we're now seeing sport resume. The capacity for sport to resume very much depends on the surrounding public health situation in relation to the pandemic, and that varies greatly from country to country. In New Zealand, crowds are back. They're playing in front of crowds again. I'm here in Switzerland. The games are resuming without fans. In Australia and in various leagues there, games are resuming without fans. And in North America, we are obviously seeing troubling statistics. So it's becoming harder and harder for sport to resume. I would just probably finish with the following points very, very quickly. The real challenge now is to get the return to play protocols right. And we would say, generally speaking, they seem to be very strong when it comes to measures that prevent the introduction or the spread of the virus within the athletic population. But we still know so little about the virus that we remain acutely concerned about the impact of it on athletes who may actually contract the illness. We have seen deaths in young people. And remember, this is a virus that attacks the lungs, it attacks the organs, it causes blood clotting, and an athlete needs to be able to recover health to an elite level so that they can resume an athletic career, not just return to an ordinary level of functionality. So we'll have to monitor this very, very closely. And of course, the other big issue, which I'll finish on, is the economic impact. Again, the economic impact for some industries will be devastating. I think for sport, it will be for many years. We've gone through a shutdown now, but the economic response will be interesting. And again, the more powerfully represented the players are, I think they will be able to negotiate for a longer economic recovery. Therefore, the economic impact can be smoothed over a longer period of time, if that makes sense. Whereas I think those that are more vulnerable, the workers that aren't well protected, we could unfortunately not only see a return to the precariousness we had before COVID-19, but we could see businesses opportunistically take advantage of the very vulnerable positions that people are in because of the pandemic and actually worsen the situation. So we are at a very significant fork in the road. And obviously I work in the player association movement, I work in the labour movement. It's very important that people's rights are respected, that people have good representation, And perhaps the coincidence of the pandemic with the Black Lives Matter campaign may also create a situation that people's rights do need to be respected, that there is a very important conversation taking place about people's rights. And in that context, we can be optimistic, but we're going to have to organize, and none of this will happen by accident. We're going to have to work very, very hard as a collective to try and realize a more just future.
Thanks, Brendan. So from what I gather from the points that you mentioned is that there is going to be gross inequality with respect to how certain sports respond, because some sports, we have to be honest, are much more supported in terms of liquidity, in terms of labor than others. So I'd just like to take this to Nisha, who currently trains many Olympic swimmers for India. And the pandemic has hit us at a point when not only swimmers, but almost all the athletes were gearing up for the Olympics. Now, as Brendan mentioned, there is going to be some sort of, as in people aren't really going to know whether the Olympics happen in the first place. But at the same time, they also want to practice and train. So in this regard, how do you balance public health and health of players with the need to get back to training so that they can secure their livelihood?
I think it's a very unique challenge with swimming, only because, in Karnataka, where we are from, all other sports have been allowed to resume because the numbers haven't been that alarming as of now. So every sport other than swimming and gymnastics, sadly. So, our athletes who already were, fighting to stay up in the top 100, we have a couple of boys in the top 100 in the world. They have not been allowed to swim now for 4 months, and it doesn't look like, with the numbers increasing now, and India being in this, very precarious stage of, where now there's community transmission, it looks like pools won't open for another couple of months. And so I think as swimmers, you face a unique challenge because athletes, there's only so much you can do to replicate what you're doing in the pool on land. Of course, every athlete from the junior kids who are 8, 9, 10 swimming, to represent their state, right up to the Olympians who've qualified and done their B qualifying for Tokyo. Everyone is doing a lot of fitness. They're working on strength and conditioning. They're working on mental health, mental training. And that's pretty much all they can do right now because, replicating training on land is something that just cannot happen. So as I think, like you were talking about the industry not being well represented, the swimming and coaching and teaching industry as well has not been represented at all because, the government seems to think that everyone's just running these public pools, which we have 200 people jumping in and it's like a free for all, everyone's coming to have a little bath. They don't think of it as an industry where people have livelihoods to worry about, the fact that so many people are losing jobs, swimming pools have to shut down. Through this, we've had to keep our pools running because, removing water from the pool is much more expensive. So we're keeping the pools running. We have high maintenance costs. And, there have been lots of studies world over which show that chlorine is actually one of the best disinfectants. So in terms of a playing space, like, say you're on a soccer field and there's a lot of contact, in swimming can be avoided where we all swim in lanes, So if there are 8 lanes in the pool, you could put 8 swimmers in a lane. You have chlorine, which is a great disinfectant if you maintain it to the correct level, which most academies in India do. And the other thing is that, you can just stay away from common areas like changing rooms unless you really need to, and they will always be sanitized. So the big challenge we're facing here is a lot of countries all over the world, a lot of swimming, the top swimming nations like Australia and America, they are getting back to the pools with these new safety measures. But in India, we don't have that chance right now, and we don't know how long it will be. There's no communication from the government, from the Sports Authority of India, from IOA, from the Karnataka Swimming Association. So no one knows anything. So it could be 3 months, it could be a year. So that is huge for somebody who maybe this is their final chance to make an Olympics, or, you are in great form already, and then you've had 4 months where you haven't entered the water. We have something called the feel of the water, which you can only get if you're actually in the water. You can be really fit, but unless you're in the water training every day, you lose that feel for the water. So it's going to be a long road. Like Brendan was saying, it's going to take at least a year or 2 before I think swimming can get back to where it was, whether it's the athlete or even the academies, trying to struggle to stay afloat.
So what I found really interesting in what you mentioned is the fact that one of the reasons you think it's so difficult is because sport isn't even considered to be an industry. So I'd really like to ask Saurabh his views on that, because I think Mizoram has recently accorded that status to sport and whether that's going to help. But just before we dive in, I'd just like to get Somdev's reaction on what Nisha said. So do you think tennis is doing any better on this regard? We've seen the infamous Djokovic scandal because of the recent tournament. But apart from that, how is Indian tennis geared for sport in the near future?
Yeah, first of all, great points from Nisha and Brendan. I think very, very valid. I think what we're all agreeing on is that you can't really blame anybody for the situations that have kind of come out of this pandemic. All we can do and all we can, I guess, ask for is how do you have a group of people that's collectively working very hard to actually get everybody back on their feet in the safest possible way. And I think it's really as simple as that. And not to be a pessimist, but just given the track record that I've kind of seen in sport in India, I don't think that we're in the best hands. And I'm simply saying that from the standpoint of see, there were many problems that existed in sport before the pandemic, and I'm just saying that now that the pandemic has hit, those problems, when we build back, we want to build to a place where we get better than where we were. Yes, it's going to take some time, but still we need to lay the foundations where things get better. So, I wouldn't mind getting into specifics a little bit later, but I think, I will let Saurabh kind of chat now. But I will say this, that I still think those problems that existed before are still going to exist later. And unless we actually address them, we're going to have, a whole lot of different problems that we can't fix. And if we keep depending on the same people who have not fixed our previous problems to now fix our future problems, I think that's short-sighted of us.
So it's not a COVID-only problem. Saurabh, would you like to react to that as well as the industry status, whether that could make it better?
Thank you for laying down the context. And I think all the three panelists who have preceded me have pretty much given the challenges that are associated with sports and COVID, both the public health crisis as well as the livelihood crisis. But I'll take on from what Somdev just said. COVID has presented a fresh set of challenges, but many of the challenges existed already. In some ways, magnified the crisis of livelihood that exists both within sports from athletes' point of view, as well as the whole sports ecosystem. A couple of larger points I'd like to make. One, to take off from what Brendan said, we need to understand that right to livelihood and right to safe, secure, and decent work is a basic human right that we expect every person, an athlete, a support worker, a ground staff, a coaching academy staff, all of them are entitled to that. And yet, in the glamour that is associated with the world of sports, issues of livelihood have traditionally not occupied the same kind of attention. And even when it has, we always see it through the prism of very rich elite footballers and cricketers. And we often begin to wonder, should we at all then talk of livelihood in such a context? But we need to understand that sports cuts across a vast categories of sectors, each sport having its own unique traits, as Nisha pointed out with specific example of swimming. And we need to be able to have a differentiated approach to different sports, perhaps, because you surely cannot treat amateur sports in the same way as a fully professionalized sport, a sport which is largely done through national system with national teams, and a sport where private clubs and private entrepreneurs are an integral and dominant player. So we need to be able to have that differentiated approach. The second thing we need to be able to clearly have a grasp on is the livelihood challenges of those athletes who may not have reached the most elite level. They are perhaps far more vulnerable than some of the global sports persons, and at the same time, their capacity to manage those risks are far limited. And given the monopolistic character of sports industry in general, their vulnerability becomes that much more acute. while it's true, and we have to repeatedly affirm that sportspersons are workers and their rights as workers must be foregrounded, it's also true that sportspersons in many ways are far more vulnerable than traditional worker, given that you may have a limited set of employers, which means your bargaining power is severely compromised. The fact that you have a very short career, unlike a professor who may work till the age of 65, also means that your capacity to resist work or pull away from work in the form of strikes that other workers can do is very limited for sportspersons from that angle. The risks of injury, the risks of other health issues also makes them far more vulnerable. So that's one that we need to acknowledge. The second is, once we move beyond sportspersons, with respect to support staff, the other workers who are part of the sports ecosystem are often working in extremely precarious conditions of employment, often in no formalized mode of employment. Often the work is outsourced, which makes them so much more vulnerable. Even establishing a relationship of employment can be a challenge. And speaking of responding to special challenges like COVID, even some of the most elementary employment rights that we expect blue-collar workers to have in other sectors are often not available to support workers. And more so in India, where much like the overall labor economy, most of the support staff are in an informalized form of employment. So that's one of the things that we need to emphasize on. And as far as your question about recognition of sports as an industry, there are two dimensions to it. One is from a policy point of view, where it comes to tax incentives, infrastructural benefits, subsidies, and others. The fact that Mizoram has been the first state to do this will make investment in sports sector far more attractive, and a range of economic benefits would come along with that. But as far as labor rights of workers in the sports industry goes, one still needs to be a little skeptical, because it by itself does not change the status vis-a-vis the labor laws. I must say, however, at least in India, and in my opinion, since 1978, since this major decision which almost all law students who have studied labor law would be aware of, the Bangalore water supply case, it can be argued that sports is an industry for the purpose of Industrial Disputes Act. The bigger challenge is to establish relationship of employment. Bigger challenge is to establish coverage within the social security laws that have been put in place. And while India has its own specific challenges, I believe many of them cut across global borders. That a lot of your traditional social security laws were built around the assumption of an industrial worker. Now, workers in the sports sector don't have the same pattern of employment. Then how reasonable and how viable is the same models of social security for sports sector? And I believe that there has to be some degree of thinking on it. It's not merely sufficient to say that, yes, they are workers, but we have to think in terms of specificity of sport and maybe develop well-crafted and tailored legislation that can extend meaningful protection to workers in the sports sector. And the other details perhaps we can take on through other conversation. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Saurabh. So I'd like to take this to Brendan now, because what you mentioned is that if at all industry status is going to be given across India, there's going to be an increase in investment. So liquidity is not going to be an issue. But he also mentioned that he's skeptical about that investment trickling down into better labor structures or better livelihoods for laborers who are in a precarious position. So why do you think sport operates in such a way that when there are profits, the profits are maximized at the top of the pyramid, but when there are losses, the losses are sort of pushed down to the bottom of the pyramid? Why doesn't it work both ways?
Well, you could say that about business, can't you? You know, the lack of liquidity. We've had a 20 or 30 year period of robust economic growth, increased competition, opening up of trade. And as soon as this pandemic hits, within weeks, even in a lesser period, we've got massive layoffs and the government has had to come in and pump trillions of dollars into the economy just so that it can function. So clearly the system is very problematic. One of our guiding principles was strong global governments and remain strong global governance. But the reality is we're living in a very polarized society at the moment, and it's very difficult for people to reach a consensus on a sustainable basis. And we've seen in some countries where there has been a political consensus in the early part of the pandemic, that's now starting to break down, and even the science is becoming politicized in some countries. So surely science is knowledge. and so we're in a difficult situation. In relation to sport, the governance is very important. So some sports are run in a very avaricious way. If we look at European soccer, there's strong private ownership. It's a competitive environment. Promotion and relegation, it's essential to transfer players. It's essential to get into the European and the international competitions. And there's huge precariousness and in that overall economy, despite the amount of wealth that's in it. Other sports are governed on a not-for-profit basis, such as in Australia and New Zealand. And those sports end up giving their elite players a lower share of revenue by agreement, say 30% instead of 50%, so that there is that investment in developing the game. And so there is a whole of game approach. And the boards that run these games are independent commissioners accountable for an overall vision. And I believe that when the investment is made, those sports will have a competitive advantage because they'll be able to ensure that there's an investment in women's sport, for example, an investment in elite development and an investment in grassroots. So governance will be very, very important, as well as representation. And it will be very interesting to watch. I think women's sport and FIFPro, the World Players Union, has issued some very important research on this. It was really on a growing wave. We had 85,000, I think it was, at the women's T20 Cricket World Cup final in Melbourne, a world record crowd. Australia's just been given the rights to host the World Cup in 2023 after incredible tournaments in 2019. We saw the United States champion for equal pay. So women's sport is on the way up, but it doesn't yet have the consolidated revenue. And so without governance, there may not be investment there. People are going to have to fight for that investment. The sports at the moment which are best positioned are those with strong, lucrative media rights deals, because they still have some revenue coming in when the stadia are empty. And absent those strong media rights deals, sport is very vulnerable. So governance will be important, I think, and hopefully a whole of game governance can be embraced, and some long-term thinking to come out of a crisis, which is a challenge to human nature in many ways.
I think Somdev wants to jump in, and I actually had a question for him. So according to the panelists from day one, in the funding of sports panel especially, they had mentioned that it's actually not about not having sufficient funds, because the ministry has actually given back some of the allotted funds to the union budget and the state budget, sorry. So it's not really about not having the money, but not utilizing the money efficiently or effectively. So Somdev, if you could jump in and if you could just let us know if this is a governance issue and whether you have witnessed that firsthand, that might be very helpful to our viewers.
First, great question, first of all. And yes, I do think it is a governance issue. And I mean, just to make it very simple. So I think there was a scheme where, the government was giving out chunks of 5 lakhs of rupees, roughly 8 or 10,000 euros or so to every kid under the age of, 14 or 16, like something like that, to kind of help them in their careers. Now, from the outside, it looks like this is an unbelievable thing, right? Because you're going out there and you're giving each kid 5 lakhs, and 5 lakhs when you're 14 is a boatload of money. But the problem isn't that they're giving out 5 lakhs. The problem, in my opinion, is that that's the laziest way to spend the 5 lakhs. Because why would you think, and I'm saying this as a former athlete, why do you think a 14-year-old and their parents know the best way to spend the 5 lakhs the most efficiently? So that obviously comes down to governance. And, once again, coming back to what Brendan was saying, I think he absolutely hit the nail on the head when he said that the people who will be at an advantage coming out of this pandemic are people that are going to be, obviously a little bit more independent. And I think, India for me is very interesting because there's two polar opposites that are very, very, very clear for everyone to see. One is BCCI. BCCI, like imagine if the BCCI had to wait for government orders in order to try and carry things out. Why has the BCCI progressed more than any other sport? Is because they have independent thinking. They have the ability to think long term, and nothing takes them away from their long term thinking. So when the IPL started, it was what it was, and now it is what it is. But unfortunately, I actually don't think, and I'd love to hear everybody else's thoughts on this, but I actually don't think that the way the current sporting system is set up is actually set up to have a long-term vision. And simply, and the number one reason I can give you for that is every person who comes in, whether it's a sports secretary or whether it's a sports minister, and I've worked, not at much depth, but I've worked fairly closely with both positions. And, I will say one of the most problematic things is when these people keep changing positions every 2 years. So a person who has absolutely nothing to do with sports will come into sports. By the time they understand it, you can have discussions and talk about things and present projects and talk about long-term visions and how it's going to actually make a difference to the sport. But by the time they understand it and they maybe approve it, they're gone, they're transferred off to the next position, and in comes another person, and now you have to convince them again. So, this cycle, unfortunately, will continue over and over again because you're mixing up sports with political policy or government policy. And, if you look at the sports that do well internationally, the government just goes out there and supports the sport. But the sport is run independent of what's happening with everything else. And I think India needs to reach a position where every sport runs the same way as the BCCI does. Regardless of who's going out there and winning elections, the BCCI is still going to go out there and put people in the stands. They're still going to go out there and have great events. And I don't see that happening with other sports. And it needs to be a long-term vision.
I think Somdev makes a very important point on how changes on top have such ripple effects on just the rest of the pyramid. And I'd like Nisha to jump in. And Nisha, you've had experiences with dealing with sport, both as an athlete as well as now you run a private academy. So how connected do you think is the fact that you are having trouble now with your academy, and that further trickles down with the way you pay your employees, the way the lifeguards are working right now, the way parents are dealing with it? And not just an athlete-centric view, but generally the cleaners of the pools, the people who sort of are security staff at your academy. How are things like that getting affected because maybe you're not getting enough attention from your federation?
I think what Somdev said is spot on because, everyone knows that BCCI has done so much for the sport of cricket. We'd like to complain and say, Olympic sports don't get their due. But that's because the federations haven't really done anything. Like you said, we've had politicians or, people in their 70s running our swimming federation for years. And so one part of it is, having ex-swimmers coming back into the sport and getting into the federation. Now, I'm quite outspoken, and that's why I've never been allowed to be part of any, whether it's the state or the national federation, because obviously I'd fight for the rights of the players. Here, it's all about pocketing money, sadly. Everyone knows, this fact. So to put it bluntly, yes, if we had people, good governance, bringing in the money, making the sport more attractive, and then it will slowly trickle down. Because first of all, swimming, unlike even tennis, is an amateur sport. So you don't play for prize money. You play for a gold medal, which isn't even a gold medal, unless you get an Olympic medal. So the fact is already it's so difficult for the athlete to even get through their career. My parents sold our family house just to support my career, and maybe in my entire career, I got maybe 6 lakhs worth of prize money, which is peanuts. They was probably spent close to 1 crore of their money, so that's what it takes. Now you have an Abhinav Bindra who had access to the funding, got a little help from the federation, yes, but his dad built a shooting range at the back of his house. which is probably one of the reasons he had access to the best possible facilities, and he got us our gold medal. So we're talking about getting to that Olympic medal, we need a lot more professional approach. And like you said, because the federations don't do a good job, swimming, there's absolutely no money in swimming. I know the few competitive athletes that we have now lost their sponsors over this last 4-month period. And I worked with a couple of brands to get them, and we worked so hard to get these athletes the sponsorships. And, by the second week of the lockdown, they said, listen, I'm sorry, but we're going to have to cancel all funding, including those training for Tokyo, who qualified for Tokyo. So it was just heart-wrenching. But going down, from the elite athlete all the way down, what Somdev was mentioning, where athletes at the Khelo India Games, who won the Khelo India Games, it was a nationwide inter-school competition. The government was giving them 5 lakhs. And the only good thing about that, and what I feel, is that the money went directly to the hands of the athletes, because otherwise that same 5 lakhs, if it came to the federation, by the time it came back to the athlete, would have been pretty negligible, And one of the reasons that there was even some money going into sport is because I think we had an ex-Olympian, Olympic medalist, Rajavardhan Rathore, who was the sports minister. So he understood sport. But like Somdev said, by the time he could actually put some good policies into place, try and make an effort right from the grassroots level all the way to the elite level, he's not there anymore. And, we have a new sports minister to deal with. And so it is very difficult. I know that the people being affected most by this, at least from what I've seen, are the people who deal with maintenance in pools. Like you said, the athletes come from, different backgrounds. Some of them have the funding to, continue. Most of them have lost their sponsorships, but they still manage. They can still put food on their table. But if you look at people I know in my own academy that do maintenance for us, cleaners, lifeguards, and, some of them, they don't have any other way of earning a living. So we in this period are trying to upskill them. We're saying even our coaches who, we can't really do online classes for swimming. So the only thing they can do is get into the business of maintenance, where, pools all over Bangalore are lying vacant, but at some point they'll be used. So we're trying to upskill these coaches and teaching them, how to maintain pools. So we as a business are trying, to provide for our, employees, not just by, giving them a check, but also in the future, things are going to change drastically. We're expecting a good 50-60% loss in, annual revenue, and most sports are facing this. So we have to kind of upskill these people, give them that confidence. We have, we need to be trained. First of all, a lot of our coaches and teachers in different sports across India don't have even a basic certification, so, they can't go to another academy where they can get a better pay, or they can't go to another country. So they feel, like sometimes I've actually seen coaches who now work as security guards. They've not had that education. Sometimes they can't afford it. They want it, So I think academies all over, the federations need to do a lot more in terms of coaching and teaching, education, even maintenance. There's so many degrees that you can get out of the country, but in India, there's nothing. My husband was looking to do one, and he managed to find one course over 10 years in terms of how do you maintain and run a swimming pool, and he did it. But they had maybe 10 people in it. So you have 10 people who are certified to maintain pools in India right now. And the rest are just, at this point, they'll say, sports isn't going anywhere. The pools are closed. Let me move on and do something else. So sadly, they are the ones that are worst affected. And, it's great that we have campaigns like Play for India, where they're trying to support the whole ecosystem. And I hope, I know Viren Raskina, part of the hockey movement, they managed to raise something like 22 lakhs. And this will go to all the different states. It will go right from, people who are working on the grounds to, coaches and teachers who really need it. So I think it's time also for the public to kind of come forward and support, sports as well, the business of sports.
Right. I'd just like to get to Saurabh on this. So you mentioned the dignity of labor initially, and how that's so important across jobs in sport and anywhere else. So how do you think caste and gender plays into this dynamic? Do you think it's skewed in such a way that certain jobs are just considered a lot more reputed, and the diversity in that job is not that much? For instance, do you think there's a lot more skewed presence of lower castes or lower classes in a blue-collar job or like a support worker job, but athletes are probably far more represented on a higher class side? And just tying that in with what Nisha mentioned, do you think in such a situation, a rights-oriented approach will work better in securing worker rights? Or do you think we can just depend on the fact that there are philanthropists and charities that are trying to help you in such times?
Mm-hmm. No, that's quite a critical point. At one level, we also need to see what we have found across the labor economy, that there is a preponderance of people from marginalized communities, from so-called low caste, within more precarious jobs, within the most vulnerable jobs. While I haven't come across systematic empirical work in the field of sports per se, my sense would be that a similar results can also be found if a study is done within the field of sports also. And you find anecdotal accounts when you look at Malis and others who work on cricket grounds. You'd often find that, yes, many of them would be overwhelmingly from either backward castes or from some of the other underprivileged communities. So that's one part that has to be addressed. And I believe at some level, sporting organizations need to think in terms of greater inclusion and what could be measures that could be thought of, both at the level of sports persons, also at the level of sports managers and others, what sort of diversity measures can be introduced. And it's been an extremely contentious debate in the field of private sector employments anywhere, and not just private sector, of course, government sector has had a very fractious history. But I think sports organizations on their own have to think of it. And only area where you can find some amount of work that has been done with sports persons. And you have had people like Ramchandra Guha and others who have written about the number of cricketers who have come from Dalit communities, and you would have them on fingertips. And perhaps that gives you an indication of the nature of barriers that exist for people to climb up to the most elite level of a sports. And as far as protection of workers go, and COVID has really shown up the absence of meaningful and effective protection for workers within the or across the sports ecosystem. Yes, perhaps sports organizations on their own have to think of measures, whether they raise money through philanthropic donations or they have a larger allocation of their own surplus for some form of pension or other forms of social assistance for workers needs to be thought through. But yes, as you said, we need to perhaps move away from charity to rights. Because if we believe that everybody has a right to decent livelihood, if everybody has a right to subsistence, then we must not rely only on philanthropic support, but must speak in terms of contractual rights of workers. We must speak in terms of rights as citizens also. And while this may go beyond the theme of this panel, but I think the failure to universalize some sort of basic support in response to COVID in India was a grand failure on part of the government. And perhaps all policymakers need to think through whether the fear of recurrence of further pandemics like this actually emphasizes on the need for some form of universal social support. But within the sports sector, yes, perhaps if we think in terms of recognizing contractual rights of workers and having some form of pension, having some form of unemployment allowance, basic income support, go a long way. How much can be afforded? Certainly a BCCI can afford much more than what other organizations can. But there are ways in which minimal support can be developed. And even the government, if you have seen over the last few years, they have introduced some pension scheme. They've also the Pandit Deen Dayal Upadhyay social welfare scheme. Most of them are very limited and they need to be expanded. But I think now is the time to really have a serious conversation on concrete ways of how to expand such protection, both at the government level as well as within the levels of sports organizations. Though I must sound a note of caution and skepticism that unless there is organization, unless there is some strong representational strength, it's unlikely to happen. Workers' rights did not come through as a matter of gratuity by employers. They came through because of strong organization and mobilization by workers historically. And something similar has to happen in sports. And unless that happens, I'm not very sanguine about there being strong social security programs for sports persons and other support workers.
So I think Somdev wanted to add a point, and I think right after we can jump into